Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which I'm sad to report is still wrapped in a pandemic that is, while it feels controlled in the United States, certainly the numbers indicate that something great has happened here. We have to remember this is a global contagion, and there are 6 billion people on the planet of 7.8 billion people who haven't had a single shot yet. Vaccine inequity is the hashtag, unfortunately, still not equity. I've done dozens of sessions on related topics, and of course on climate change and resilience here on the Earth Institute, and now Climate School. Sustain What webcast. I'm Andy Revkin, and today's show we're going to focus on capitalism and climate, and can we get the worst aspects of capitalism out of the climate system? At least that's the way I look at it when I read Kate Aronoff's great work in The New Republic and her new book, which we'll learn more about in a second. Thanks for coming on, Kate. I've been looking forward to connecting with you on this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Good to be here.
And along with us is Jackie Klopp, who's a professor at the Columbia Climate School and has been here for a long time, has a real focus on transportation, infrastructure, and how that affects society and people, and how it affects the environment and climate. And a real great systems thinker, and one of the more dynamic presences at the university that I've met in terms of interfacing with making sure young people are integrated into the conversation. Jackie, great to have you on the show here today. You're muted for the moment.
Oh, classic.
Yeah, I know. It's just a norm.
It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to be here to discuss this wonderful book.
Yeah. So let me just go to the first slide here. You know, you've been working on this for years. It's a kind of, I wouldn't say your life's work, but maybe if you could give a thumbnail sketch of how you came to focus on climate in the context of society, that'd be a good starting point. And we're here, we have the, we'll go through some of the key points in the book. I included the table of contents, which goes from, basically starts with the new climate denial and ends with hope, a big dose of hope and a big rejection of doomism, and with a lot in the middle that really builds on your work on the Green New Deal as well. So here's you've been writing about the Green New Deal since before there was one, essentially helped to, I think, shape the whole concept of that. So going back to the book though, so what brought you to this point? I noticed in the book you said you were born the same year as the Framework Convention on Climate Change was born, in 1992. You know, you have great reporting skills. You could do anything with those skills. So why here into this arena that I've been stuck in?
Yeah, thank you so much for posting the table of contents there. It's nice to have that in the background. Yeah, so I've been reporting for about 5 years full time, give or take. And before that, in college, was working on the fossil fuel divestment movement, really from kind of freshman year on, trying to get my college's endowment out of fossil fuel money. And so I've been sort of around climate spaces for a decent chunk of time since then, working kind of around groups like 350.org and folks who are really involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement. And through that got to visit with folks who were resisting mountaintop removal coal mining, seeing sort of close up the effects of the fossil fuel economy on people, and how it has structured sort of whole society. So that's really, that got me sort of hooked, I think, was getting to talk to people who are, dealing with this close up, and, obviously learning more about the crisis, which I think is sort of a common thread among people who do this type of work. But at some point decided and realized I was better at writing than I was at organizing per se. And so decided to do that full time, and, wanted to be an academic at some point and in college, and realized that, the thing that I wanted to do, or, I was looking for, I could do in reporting, which is, getting to talk to people about kind of what sorts of things they were working on, about the kinds of issues and topics that I cared about. And so, stuck with journalism and sort of expecting that I would never, be able to string together a job for more than a year at a time, which was the case until very recently. And somehow I've been able to keep doing it for for the last 5 years, and have not gotten sick of the climate beat, despite it being a massively sort of depressing subject to follow. But I've just found it, because I think, as I say in the book, I think climate is really the terrain on which politics plays out. Is now and will increasingly be the case over the coming decades. It's hard for me to imagine working on anything that wasn't climate related, just because I feel like every subject really ends up tying back to it in some way or another. And so have used the climate beat to look at the ways, that both how we got here, which is roughly the first half of the book, and what we might be able to do about it. So that's, kept me busy, and was enough to write the book, which I'll just say briefly, really comes out of doing this reporting, both, through the kind of tail end of the Obama administration and the start of the Trump administration, looking at the primary campaign, the Democratic primary in 2016, when I, got my first full-time reporting job in these times, was talking to climate scientists and, asking them to describe kind of what would need to happen in order to take on this problem at scale. And they would, describe in sort of no uncertain terms, just the sort of huge transformative shifts that would need to happen, the kind of stuff that shows up in the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, transformative changes to our built environment, to, many, many facets of everyday life. And there was such a gap between that and kind of what was on the table politically, really across the political spectrum, whether it was Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton's plans in 2016. And so, was really interested in that gap and kind of what was behind it. And so that, fueled interest in the book. And then through the Trump administration, when I was, kind of starting to think about it sort of properly and then report it, just saw the bar be so low, and the bar for, what constituted sort of thinking about a good line or a good position on climate change, grow even further out of touch with the scale of the crisis. And so I was kind of interested through the book in mining that difference. And then, of course, when I was writing it, not long after I pitched it and got the contract, the Green New Deal burst onto the scene, which I think it gave the book maybe a more hopeful edge than when I started. Yeah.
So before we get more into the details in the book and your thinking, your reporting, you mentioned something important, the Trump factor. And in the book you stress, and I think it's very appropriate, that Trump could be distracting from the bigger systemic challenges that long predated him. He was sort of like a cartoonish crystallization of many things. But can you just dive into that briefly, and then I'm going to talk about some of Jacqueline's work too.
Yeah, I talk about this in the book a bit, but I think there's a way to understand Trump as just a continuation, right, of 40 or 50 years of changes in the GOP, dating back to the days of Barry Goldwater, and the sort of fight for minority rule, right, to ensconce power with as few as wealthy people as possible, and really degrade representative democracy, which I think Trump very much fits in that project. I think there is something that's unique and novel about Trump that I don't think should be sort of undercounted. And the book actually doesn't spend too much time sort of talking about him, but he's obviously in the background, was very literally in the background of writing the book. But
that must have been a weird experience in itself, just having to deal with that constant drumbeat of Trumpian reverberation while you were trying to do the focus thing of create this thesis.
Yeah, especially in the pandemic, where it was really unavoidable from my living room. I think the way it shaped the book most meaningfully, I think, was really taking seriously the fact that there is a lot of climate policy that's already being written. I mean, right? Trump passed climate policy through draconian restrictions on refugees, by border policies, all of the sort of work he did to criminalize huge amounts of people in this country. And so that is climate policy, right? Whether he calls it or not, even if he's denying that the problem exists, that is that is what will shape the future. And that is, I think has to be understood in that frame. And so that's how I tried to think about Trump and sort of Trumpism and this broader, right-wing resurgence throughout throughout the book as being climate politics, even if it's not framed as such.
So Jackie, you focus a lot on these systemic questions around urbanization, the urban life that's the dominant form of life for human beings on the planet right now, and even more so going forward. And you've dived into this book, I know. So when you think about this issue of capitalism systems, whether it's transportation systems or political systems, how do you think the book informs pathways forward? And I'm just showing a sort of a snapshot of some of your writing.
Yeah, I think this book does a really important thing in really showing the big picture and the way that climate change is not a struggle that's happening among, a small bubble of people, right? That it is so fundamental to our future and to the way we live and the way we're going to live. And I think sometimes people don't understand that the power of the fossil fuel interests is so immense. And, they have invested enormous amounts in continuing extraction, and which means emissions and more pollution and dramatic climate change impacts. And that they're resisting, and they're creative in resisting, and that all of us have an interest in really countering that and building a new politics. And I think sometimes people don't understand that we can't just keep tinkering and doing things within the way things are, that we really need a more radical shift, and radical in the sense of getting to the root of the problem.
Right.
Yeah, and that shapes everything, including our cities that are heavily built around, the automobile run on petroleum. That has really shaped a lot of our urban life over the last while. So,
yeah, I recently was engaging on Twitter around the ghost of Robert Moses, who kind of reflects that power broker, literally the power broker concept of dominion over neighborhoods, dominion over identity, especially those who are excluded or underrepresented in power frames. You end up with these bizarre landscapes and now climatescapes, and that really is at the heart of your book, I think, Kate. And my question always is, so what needs to happen for that break? Alex Steffen, just the other day, a longtime sustainability writer on Twitter, and I think he's writing a book called Snap Forward. And it's like the same thing, vault from this mess we're in to this. It's not going to be incremental. So Kate, I think that's a big part of your book is it can't be incremental. So the question is then what? So what's the thesis and how that works and happens?
Yeah, I sort of try to think about it along two tracks. I think one is looking, just at kind of what needs to change, right? Like, how do we phase down the fossil fuel industry, create better electric utilities, potentially public utilities, realign our kind of working days with something that's in sustainable and kind of planetarily responsible, invest research funding and make sure that the public sector can really do what it's good at doing, which is, funding innovation. So that's sort of one end of things. And then I think there's this big, potentially the bigger question is like the political task. And the book really focuses on the US in particular, in the US as kind of a global actor with a lot of power on the world stage. And, tries to think about what it would look like to get all of these big changes, which is not, an easy sort of path, certainly with, such narrow majorities in the Senate, a massively undemocratic political system that's only gotten less democratic in the last several years through, changes to the court systems and things like that, new appointments. The case I make is one that isn't unique to me. I think this, has been a sort of operating theory of a lot of progressive climate politics for the last couple of years, which is that, much like the original New Deal, for all its flaws and contradictions, climate politics needs to knit together a coalition, right? I think the insofar as there was a New Deal coalition that, brought millions of voters into the Democratic Party and could sustain Democratic majorities for years and years to come by making people's lives better, in large part, right? By, empowering things like labor unions, which could be a vehicle of working class power that could translate into, what was happening in Washington and politically. A Green New Deal or whatever derivation of that we end up getting needs to do the same thing, right? And so we need small d and big D, in our case, Democratic majorities, in order to keep change going, because we know decarbonization is this massive, massive project that we won't get done certainly in an infrastructure bill through reconciliation, but in one presidential term, or in two Congresses, right? There will be at least a decade of work to decarbonize the U.S. economy, and that cannot be something which is subject to what has been a sort of back and forth of our political system. And the Democratic Party, so long as the Republicans keep denying climate change, or keep sort of blocking anything called climate policy, that means needing to have a democratic control of Congress, and the way to do that, I argue, is not rocket science, politically speaking, but is to make people's lives better, is to try to build a coalition by improving people's lives, and making the case that the Democratic Party can make a difference in their lives, and can make life better than it would be without them. And I don't think that's has not been a strange concept in American politics. Certainly has become more of one in the last 40 years, as neoliberalism has sort of warped our understanding of what the government is and what it owes to its people and what it's capable of doing. And so that's the pitch, which is, I should say, the sort of operating strategy of a lot of people who are doing this work on the ground, but I don't think has quite managed to sort of trickle upward to the highest echelons quite yet.
So I'd love to get both of you to weigh in on your thoughts and feelings about the Democratic Party and this interminable push me, pull you fight between the progressives with a capital P and folks like Biden, essentially. And you were here, in his 100th day, you had this, you were talking about, or stressing this piece, that you're already seeing signs within Biden's approach of him not putting climate in the foreground. But at the same time, like that $2 trillion infrastructure bill, I'm not sure if anyone's quantified how much of it is climate related, but it's a pretty big chunk, and it's the jobs component too. So is there a way, could you both weigh in on this idea of, like, should climate maybe not be in the foreground as much, even though it's the foreground, it's this grandest issue? Or is it more divisive than it is productive to put it in the foreground? Maybe that's the question. Maybe Kate and Jackie.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, something I say in the book is that there has been this idea that we can sort of sneak climate policy around at the edges, right? That, if you just put it in as a line item and, omnibus bills, if you just sort of, try to get it written into something else, that you can have all of these little budget items add up to keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And we've seen that that's not really the case, right? I mean, for one, just the scale of what's needed is so big that it's basically impossible to sneak around the edges, right? These sort of transformative shifts are not, going to be something which happens without anybody knowing it, and in no small part because there is an entire apparatus set up to call out when climate policy is happening, that the right has, gotten very good at crafting, and is very good at drawing attention to anything, as sort of mundane as like the extension of solar and wind tax credits.
Well, it just happened with meat.
Yeah.
It was an amazing little example of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that means the left needs a lot more work on. Well, I know there was actually a big discussion on Twitter the last couple of days about the left building a much better apparatus to be ahead of that and or counteract that as part of the strategy going forward too. You're right; they're good at it.
Yeah, and I think the anecdote of that is broadly similar to kind of what I was just talking about, which is that I think climate policy itself has to be something which make people's lives better, and that has to be the association. And we've seen, some real attempts to do that, I think, from the Biden administration, and tying it to a jobs agenda and tying it to, an economic opportunity. I have, my own sort of quibbles with that, but I think that the direction of travel on that is good, and not framing it as a sort of technocratic challenge that will be meted out through, very discrete regulations. And, I think people have to see if we're going to get this done, given how big decarbonization is, then I do really think there needs to be a positive association in the public with climate policy. And it's popular, right? Things like the Green New Deal are popular. Of course, we don't have a political system which is very good at translating popular opinion into law, because it's very anti-democratic. And so therein lies the challenge. Yeah.
So Jackie, how does this play out in the classroom and in your research too? This question of trying to be nuanced and strategic about it, or just calling it for what it is, this great global challenge. I'm sure students have, well, I know from the ones I've interacted with, different opinions on this too. And how does the book inform those kinds of questions?
Yeah. First of all, I think, the majority of Americans, and certainly our students, are for addressing climate. And one thing we do in the classroom, and which this book does really well, is also show, and we can use this book in our classroom, is, that climate is not just, again, this thing that, is a narrow environmental issue. It's really about our way of life. It intersects with, it's what our economic system has produced, and the way that, we have not cared for the environment, and we have not counted it even in our economic calculations. And so our climate crisis is, one of multiple crises that is produced by, frankly, a sort of worldview and economic system that hasn't been working in many different ways. And I think that integrative approach is really important. Now, how you address transformation, you do need to be nuanced and tactical. And I do think this book gives a lot of really wonderful detail about the kinds of struggles that are going on that many of our students endorse and are part of, frankly, like we have a Sunrise Movement hub. And I think the statistics bear out that the younger generation is seeing through some of these historical arguments that the Republican Party and the right wing have continually brought forth for why we can't do better for the environment and for people, which is, it costs too much, or it's going to cost jobs. And I think thanks to a really dynamic young group coming out of activism that is now influential within the Democratic Party, you're starting to see that, more positive vision of, hey, we can do better by our planet, by our, for our people. It's possible. And we have a roadmap for addressing these issues together. And it's both, it's like a little bit what I feel in this book is you have the alarm, you have the anger at what, where we're at, but then you have this hope and this possibility and this vision of a much, much better world that we know we can build. And so I get that mixture of angst and anger and alarm, and which is a real problem for some of our students who have, we have a lot of anxiety in our young folks, when they study the implications of us not acting on climate. It's devastating. But at the same time, there is this hope and this, possibility of a new world and the energy to fight for that. So I'm encouraged. And I think this book will contribute to that dialogue in some really wonderful ways.
Thank you so much. That's so good to hear. I love hearing that things that it can be useful to teach. And yeah, it seems to resonate with students.
And let's talk a little bit about doom and paralysis too. There's several flavors of this issue. The more popular one that's been stressed recently in social media is a doomism around certain writers who get a lot of attention. It's kind of like the voluntary extinction movement, which I've touched on when I was doing my daughter's blog some years back. When you're talking at the edges of these arguments, it's really easy to get people's attention. The end of the road is here, but you definitely push back against that strongly, and I think correctly. At the same time, people like Robert Bruhl, Drexel sociologist, now emeritus, and Carrie Norgard, they wrote this epic paper on social inertia, which is that once even progressives recognizing the scope of the change that's needed, in other words, as you're describing here, that creates another kind of paralysis where they kind of just get sort of stuck in not just in the scope of the problem, but the scope of the solution too. Does that keep you up at night, Kate?
Well, one of many things. I mean, I have pushed back and do in the book against the sort of doomist narrative, which I think is really irresponsible in a lot of ways. Would maybe go so far as to call it a form of climate denial, even. That I just think it's sort of like empirically false, right? We know that this is not a fight which ends. It's that every tenth of a degree translates to tens of thousands of lives lost, and just resigning to the end of the world is a really, I think, cruel way to think about this problem. But that doesn't make the question of how to do anything about it easier, right? To say that's wrong doesn't really unlock some like magical key to what to how it could be better, right? And so the pitch that I make in the book is to foreground the type of world that we can build, which I think has been hard to think about in the last 40 years. I mean, there is a historical reason dating back to anti-communism at the start of the 20th century about stamping out any sort of alternative visions for what the world could look like, even when they're all around us, right? I write a bit about the kind of like nice life that the Green New Deal could build, but that in itself, is not so far off from what day-to-day life looks like for a lot of people in places like Norway. Not the same, and I make sure not to say we want to just build a Scandinavian social democracy, which have their own very, very deep flaws and contradictions. Norway, is a petrostate, of course, or is a major oil exporter. But that like these examples of how life could work differently than it does in the United States certainly are abundant, and there are just better ways to organize society, which I think we've seen in part through COVID, right? Is that other countries who have smaller economies than we do, who are operating on a sort of different set of assumptions about what types of things are valuable for the government to invest in, have handled this crisis more successfully, have gotten their their countries back to something like normal much quicker than we've been able to. And so, there is an alternative, right, to the way that capitalism in the U.S. has played out in its own sort of uniquely cruel, unequal, racist often ways. And it's worth drawing them out. And I spend the last kind of half of the book essentially trying to resurrect some of these older ideas that have been taken off the table by, attempts to stamp out alternatives to capitalism and to, U.S., the American model in particular, and to bring out the kind of big ideas that movements have put on the table, whether that's things like the Green New Deal, but also Occupy Wall Street, the movement for Black Lives. There's been this real upwelling of real creative energy, I think, from the left over the last several years, and I think it really helps us think through this challenge, which doesn't solve any of the grand political questions about how to get there, but I think giving people a sort of vision of something to work toward has been historically important in getting big scale changes, and I think needs to be a central part of this fight too.
I'd like to ask you each to dive in a little bit on it's kind of the William Gibson idea that the future already exists. It's just not evenly distributed. the flaw in that, I always, when I first heard that aphorism, I was excited because it's true. And you see these outlier examples that really feel like they resonate. And of course, it's true in both directions. But both futures exist in the world today. Bolsonaro exists, and as well as these great examples of transition towns, for example. So I'd love to get you both to sort of look at that, the world, and in your book, Kate, the examples, maybe one example that really sort of excites you as a pattern that can build. But there is a question that came in, or a comment from a viewer, Sarah Rogers, says, there seems to be a strong reluctance to change that would shift us toward a community-minded decision-making and big picture self-accountability. If we see ourselves as part of a moving system of entities rather than individuals existing in isolated vacuums, perhaps change within ourselves and the systems of administration we are living in would come more naturally. Pretty cool question, pretty cool thought. Maybe I'll add on to that is social media could play some kind of role in having a distributed community with a common discussion. It's so broken in many ways too. But so, let's talk about this comment first and then get into those examples we were just talking about. This idea of self-accountability, Kate, you kind of reject that being part of the climate problem, meaning, industry has tried to sell us on the idea that it's our fault as individuals, but it sounds like solutions come from more of self-accounting. How does that play into your thinking?
Yeah, I think I would land somewhere in the middle. I do, speak pretty strongly against fixating on individual action within the book, in part because I think individualism is a sort of tough way to approach this. But I don't think that, evinces any conversation about personal transformation, right? I think that I just happen to think that those sorts of changes happen best when they're in community and when they're part of sort of democratic, small d democratic processes of people, coming together to sue their landlords because they're trying to evict people and kick people out, or participating, in civic life in many different ways, whether that's community organizing or joining your food co-op locally or something like that. I think there's a real I have a sort of like sappy old school attachment to these like markers of civic life that I think are genuinely really important, and I think create opportunities for the types of discussions which are very hard to have on social media. I think I am, if anything, much too online. I would like to be much less online. And I think I always feel a lot more fulfilled when I get out of a meeting or something than I do after a day spent scrolling through Twitter. So I think that it's not enough, I would say, to just say individual action doesn't work. But I think that those have to be considered as part of a movement or as part of a community, right? It's one thing for one person to go vegetarian. That's very good, to give up meat on your own, but it's a very different thing if that is connected to a push for funding for lab meat, like R&D
Right.
funding, or big sort of macro changes, which I think are what drives sort of history forward. And I just think emotionally too, it's good for people to be involved in movements. It's good for people to be involved in sort of collective projects that are pushing forward on things that they care about, because it's a really tough problem to consider alone. And a lot of the young people I spoke to for this book, and Jackie, and I would be curious to hear kind of your take on this in teaching too. Have gone through periods of just feeling really isolated and feeling really really burned out and pretty down on kind of what the next several years looks like. And it's been through joining things like Sunrise and through getting involved in things like the climate strikes that people begin to sort of feel a sense of hope and empowerment around this like unfathomably huge problem. And I think that's really important, and that is in some ways an individual action, I think, but a really I think a really important one.
Jackie, you've done field work, around New York City and the like, but also in Kenya and elsewhere. So getting back to that idea of examples, best case or worst case, and obviously respond to anything that that sparked you with what Kate was just laying out. But what lessons have you learned looking at such disparate places as Kenya and Queens.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as humans, we face this common collective challenge, and I was just having a discussion yesterday about, the fact that despite our climate crisis and despite everything we know about highways as, dangerous, ripping up social fabric, we see a whole lot of that going on in Kenya and other places. So we have these global funds that are, continuing to move into these high emissions, dangerous, and obsolete infrastructures for our cities. And so we were just talking about how some of the struggles that environmentalists have in Kenya and other activists around, improving urban life, whether you care about air pollution or crashes, which is the #1 killer of young people globally. The highway in the middle of the city is a bad thing. So there's this mass mobilization, and one of my colleagues who works here in New York on American and American issues, she said, "Wow, this sounds very similar to the anti-highway, struggles we had in our cities." And I said, yes. So, I mean, some of these struggles really are global, and they take different form in different places. But coming back to Sarah's really important comment, we are social beings, and I think we need to care for each other as we need to care for the planet that sustains us. And I think COVID has really also made us more aware of how social we are by having forced us in many places all across the globe to be really, stuck as an individual and a family, perhaps, in a little cocoon. And I think it's made us realize that that we are social, and even the problem of this pandemic can certainly not be solved and has not been solved by a fragmented, individualistically minded system, right? Like the hoarding of vaccines, the inability to share intellectual property to get vaccine production up across the globe so that we can all be safe from mutations of this virus that will continue if we don't work together. I think COVID has created an opportunity for us to reflect on our social being. And I think, honestly, conservatives have an idea of this, right? In terms of, their collective, communities-based support for each other, which we have to respect. And, also these young mobilizers, who are building joyful communities around these really important issues. So, we are social beings. We don't want to talk about socialism, as you mentioned at the end of your book, but, we need to create systems that allow us to cooperate and create the public goods and the things we value that are not currently valued in this kind of market ideology that dominates in our political systems. And I think Kate's book really does a beautiful job of articulating that.
Yeah, and this piece, and also your writing does too.
Yes. I mean, there's accountability that we should have as democratic societies. And not all societies are democratic, and and increasingly not so, including our own. And that also has a tie-in with with our climate struggle and fossil fuel interests, which we haven't talked enough about in the public sphere, I think, in our society, in the United States.
How much of this is about envisioning? Kate, you also mentioned the control of narratives and this idea of the care economy. Last year, I did a couple of sessions on this webcast with some young scholars, mostly from Canada, this Economics for the Anthropocene network. And they really zoomed in on the idea of the care economy. And this is about valuation. It's about unpaid work, home care by relatives that's just simply sucks out the capacity to eat and sleep and have a roof. And so this feels like, at the same time, though, it reminds me of like when you learn how few congressmen have traveled abroad and see what good trains are like. And most Americans are very insular still in the way they learn and think. Do we just not have this sense of possibilities? Is that, how big a part of this do you think that is? Envisioning these positive futures and understanding how that can be something to pursue.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, I think that's been, I mean, in some very real material sense, beaten out of our political system.
Beaten out of, is that what you said?
Yeah, I mean, through red baiting, stamping out,
Yeah.
socialist groups and purging communists from unions. Like, this is a long historical process that has resulted in it being very difficult to imagine any sort of alternative, right? Even those that are, again, sort of all around us. And it's been interesting sort of watching this big infrastructure fight and this wide-ranging discussion now about what counts as infrastructure.
Oh,
in
yeah,
part,
yeah.
because we're funneling everything through this this one reconciliation package probably. And so that's, prompted, I think, in some ways a little bit of an inward looking, but in other ways, I think a very productive conversation about what counts as infrastructure. And, I've been fascinated sort of seeing, we just saw the American Families Plan is being reintroduced, or is being introduced today and announced. And even the sort of care work components of the American Jobs Plan, people, looking at the kind of climate aspects would say, oh, well, it's nice that there's a, extension of the child tax credit, that there is this, investments in care work, but it's not really a climate investment, right? And I don't think that's really true, right? And I think partially, I think that comes from talking to people in places like West Virginia who are just looking at, the sort of bare facts of the public budgets there, as the coal industry is really declining pretty rapidly and taking tax bases down with it. And what gets hit first with that, it's things like teachers and school budgets and the really sort of vital infrastructure of a community. And it's not hard to see, right, when the sort of economic basis of a community is sort of cut out from under it. What is the shock absorber of that? It's teachers, it's care, it's healthcare and things like that. Gabe Wyna just wrote a really fantastic book called The Next Shift, looking at Pittsburgh's transition from being a steel economy to a predominantly sort of healthcare eds and meds economy. And that story is clearer there maybe than anywhere else, where this industry, which provided the sort of backbone of this this kind of Midwestern Northeast city, is declining really, really rapidly for any number of reasons. And it's the healthcare system that really, steps in to both, make up budgets and in a very local sense, and allowing people to make ends meet who, have salaries as nurses and teachers even, but also repairing people's bodies who are broken down by years and years of doing this really sort of violent work that really beats people up, and from everything from sort of breathing in toxins and cancer-causing chemicals, to just the pure labor of working in a steel mill, which is really hard work, right, that really breaks people down. And so I think that there's a real lesson in that for what the transition to a low carbon economy looks like, right? Which is that I'm a little skeptical of the calls that, the thing to do is to rebuild manufacturing and get us back to something like where we were in the 1950s. And there's a lot of repair to be done, and properly valued, that can be really good work, to repair the damage to the land, plugging some of the 3.1 million abandoned, orphaned and abandoned wells in this country, reclaiming abandoned mine lands. That's work that can be done by people who are currently working in the fossil fuel industry, and repairing people's bodies that have been damaged by this economy. I mean, what was it? In 2018, there was this, Harvard study that found 1 in 5 deaths was from the fossil fuel effects of the fossil fuel industry worldwide, which is enormous. I mean, that's a human cost that I don't think we've really grappled with. And so that work is the basis of a good society. It doesn't lend itself to a profit motive, really. But I think budgets are expressions of public values. And so if we reorient kind of what things we deem as valuable, then we can, start to look at that as well-paid work that, deserves a sort of central place and importance in society.
That point you just made about the stats on the real costs of pollution is central, I think, in the sense of something else you described, which is creating value or recognizing value where it exists, meaning the care economy, valuing the care economy is the same as really integrating the costs that we don't really think about as that are distributed and really hard even to paint a picture of because they're sort of statistical. I've written a lot about small particle pollution and its impacts were studied. It's a statistical part of stroke, of heart disease, of all the lung ailments, of course. And it was that picture that was revealed of mass mortality that can drive us to change. But it's a really hard picture to sell in Congress. I did this. I was at an event once where a guy at Health and Human Services, Howard Koh, was saying, you go to a hearing and these skeptics say, well, show me the bodies. And it's like in the numbers. But I still think I'm still overall hopeful that technology and science can actually clarify these ethical questions that way. Jackie, you work a lot with all the colleagues here, like Faye McNeil and others who are working, Dan Westerfeld, who are trying to put, they were at that interface between all that data and policy too. So I'm going to ask you both if that, you feel like we're in a hopeful trajectory toward getting those valuations that really are about ethics, but that it can be driven or sort of clarified by technology and science too. Maybe Jackie first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, science and technology are tools that can be used in diverse ways. So I think it's ultimately for us as humans to think about what we value and the ethics as we get good science. And to think about the implications of that science. And in many ways, that is a task of empathy. Like, what does it mean for, millions of people to die from emissions every year that are linked to fossil fuel burning? Large numbers of people, 1 in 5, as you say, of the deaths. What does that mean? We're grappling with this again with COVID, right? The numbers, 500,000 people dead from this pandemic. That's also linked to our ecological destruction. So actually, when you talk to activists, it's very interesting because some of them say, yeah, you go to Congress and you have these statistics. But what ultimately will move them is the stories and the narratives of the human suffering and trying to get them to imagine what that means. So there's an enormous role for storytellers, for artists, for people who can convey what those numbers really mean. There are also some creative tactics. For example, recently there was lobbying around a young woman who died in London of severe asthma that turned out to be activated every time there was an enormous amount of traffic on the highway near where she lived. And, her mother didn't understand that location and that those emissions were what were really, harming her child, and was very outraged when her child ultimately died. And for the first time, they're putting on the death certificate that this was a death by air pollution. So there is, a lot of discussion around, is that really the way to go? But, I think people are coming up with creative ways and stories. Yes, thank you. Beautiful young woman. It's such a tragic story, but that story maybe can really amplify what we're talking about. So ultimately, science and technology are tools that can help us understand magnitudes and causality, but they can't make the decisions for us. And to that, we need to have that caring that we talked about each other.
I think, Andy, you're muted.
Yeah, I had to mute because, noise. Sorry. I know I was going to say Kevin Roos was on here, a technology writer for the New York Times not long ago. His new book is about how to survive in the AI world, in a world that's completely more and more algorithmic. And his thesis, his whole rationale is to be more human. It's your humanness that a machine can't replicate. It's the putting in the foreground those capacities that relate to just what we're talking about. Looking at this data in the context of this girl's life and death, and finding a way to convey that through technology, through a digital story on the Guardian website that I'm sharing with you now, feels like a frontier that can really potentially make a difference. Let's get back into the book, though, for the last 10 minutes here. It's really great to have you both together on this. And so I'm going to focus in a minute on some of the actual language at the kicker of the book, Kate. But what's your main, if you had the honor of presenting at a committee hearing in the House or Senate, maybe you already have, I'm not sure. How do you hammer this home? What's like the pathway?
Yeah, I think it's a big and in some ways kind of messy book, which I probably shouldn't be saying.
But it's a big and messy world,
Yeah.
That's actually fine.
And a big messy problem. I mean, I think for policymakers, what I think is the most salient takeaway is that, the fossil fuel industry will never be a good faith actor in this fight, right? And they're sort of pouring everything right now into trying to make themselves seem like that, right? Into trying to, posit themselves as interested in climate policy and taking this on, and as a central part of solving it, right? That their expertise means that it would be impossible to imagine a world without them, and without their sort of indefinite profits. And there is not, a livable world that contains indefinite profits for the fossil fuel industry. I think those two things are directly at odds, and the more that the fossil fuel executives are ostracized from polite society, the better. I think this is they're committing unspeakable atrocities against this planet, and have been for a very long time, with full knowledge of what they're doing. And play an unacceptable role in our society in just about every way. I mean, no less so than in the United States, and pouring so much money into warping our debate about climate politics over the last many decades, and now our debate about what to do about it. And yeah, I think that would be my takeaway for policymakers, as well as doing some low-hanging fruit, like legalizing weed at the federal level, and making our life a little better in ways that are not so difficult to imagine.
And you also, in the book, you do offer this idea of the road ahead toward a more inclusive, more less production focused and more well-being focused pathway, I think, unless I'm missing something. So there's a positive, silencing the fossil fuel greenwash, which Clean Creatives, a group that I just did a session on, is trying to do, is important. And Ken Caldera, a climate scientist, many years ago in Paris at a meeting, was saying, scientists have done a really good job of identifying the problem. Now we have to sort of do a good job of painting that picture of where we're going. And I think you do offer that kind of vision here too, in that closing section. Going back to Bertrand Russell, 1932, it's pretty cool. The book is just a really great prod to the system. I think, I and you probably have different definitions of, we could do a whole session on capitalism. Is there good capitalism, for example, or is it just is it a form of capitalism that's a problem? Extractivism, et cetera. And I don't know if we have a few minutes, we can go a little long, but the book is an excellent kind of prod to the systems, I think. Jackie, do you have your takeaway? Like if you were going to add this to a curriculum, a syllabus for the fall, what's the point you're going to have the students explore the most, or where do we go with that?
Yeah, I think, it'd be good to, have them read the whole book and come out with their own themes, very, to see what they would think. But what I really appreciate about this book is that we don't have enough integration in terms of understanding our connection between things, these different things that many different groups care about, and how they're connected. there we have anti-corruption groups, but then, the fact that the fossil fuel industry had this huge campaign, right, to really literally capture elected officials, like that should concern people who care about corruption. It should concern people who care about democracy. It should concern people who care about, is their water clean? Is their air clean? So, I think understanding that we are in a fossil fuel shaped society and that we have this monumental task to transform, this system, because it touches on pretty much everything, is really, I think, something I would like them to come away with, understanding that connectivity, and also the role for mobilization and creativity in building that alternative world. That is a much better world. And we have glimpses of that. We have pockets of that. We have pieces of that. And so that their project is to put it together and move us forward in a really profound way and really inspire them to do that. This is what I would hope for the book, besides the many very, wonderful case studies that illustrate this point in different ways.
Great. Well, Kate Aronoff, it's been great to have you on the show. Thanks for all the work you do at the New Republic. You also had a recent op-ed, I think, in the Times. In the show description, people can look up some of the links. Maybe we can come back on in a few months and see how things are going.
Yeah, I would love to.
Dig in deeper on some of the questions. I like on this show sometimes to include some of the music from the Sunday sessions I do. And there was this song, The Nestlers, my good old friends from the Clearwater and Pete Seeger's sphere that I was in, sang the banks are made of marble. So I'm going to close with this tune. This is the Earth Institute Sustain What show on Kate Aronoff and her new book, Overheated, with Jackie Klopp from the Columbia Climate School. And here's a little music to take you out.
I'll just say thank you both so much. It's such a pleasure to get to talk about the book with people who've read it. Which is the kind of thing you can't envision when you're writing it, but it's so
we'll come back.
So fun. Thank you both.
We can dive in more. So here's Rick and Donna Nestler.
Rice. I've traveled across this country from shore to mighty shore, and it really made me wonder what I heard and what I saw. Banks are made of marble with a guard at every door, and the vaults are soft with silver that the people sweated for. I saw the weary farmer plowing up his lawn, and I heard the auction hammer knocking down his little home. But the banks are made of marble with a guard at every door, and the vaults are stuffed with silver that the farmers sweated for. And I saw the weary miner scrubbing the coal dust from his back, and I heard his children saying, "We got no coal to heat this shack." But the banks are made of marble with a guard at every door, and the vaults are soft with silver that the miners sweated for. And I saw the weary seaman standing up.
So there you go. It's a great song, written decades ago, and it's about these questions you're talking about right at the heart of the book. who owns the capital, who shapes how it's invested, and what are some other approaches going forward. Just thank you to anyone out there who's listening. This can be shared 4 different ways on all kinds of platforms when we're done. And again, thanks to my guests today for being on. I'm just going to show where we go from here. So, Overheated, how capitalism broke the planet and how we fight back. It's much lauded, much discussed right now. Friday, speaking of energy futures, I'm doing a show on nuclear endings and beginnings, focused on the fact that the power plant about 8 miles from where I live in the Hudson River Valley in Lenape territory here is shutting down the last reactor after about 45 years of providing energy with lots of questions, but all that energy, other than the energy embedded in building it, was zero carbon. So there are these interesting questions and some great guests coming on to talk about where we go from here with both existing nuclear and with nuclear yet to come, if that happens. It's happening in Russia and China and Korea and other places. Does it happen here? It's up to us. And Sunday, as I mentioned earlier, a special Sunday Sanity session focusing on Pete Seeger, who has also sung many songs that are relevant to the issues embodied in the book. Thank you all for being here today. Come back anytime to sustain what? This is an operation of the Earth Institute and now the Climate School at Columbia University, my initiative on communication and sustainability, trying a little bit every day to make information matter in pursuit of sustainable climate and relationship with climate and the sustainable human journey and a just one. So thanks again to Kate and Jackie Klopp. Have a good day. Stay safe. Make sure you're and vaccinate. Take care of yourselves.